Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Midnight Watch. Thank you for joining, and let's open with a word of silent prayer. If you'll kneel, thanks. Amen. Okay, so we've been talking about the 2520. I'm going to continue that series today. We're going to do a little bit of revision. It's actually a revision of the revision that I've already done, because we're going over things a few times and slowly with some interaction today as well, so that we can all make sure that we're all up to speed and on board with where we're heading as we move forward. So it doesn't hurt to do some revision, and we're going to do that this morning and look at what we studied a bit together last time I spoke with you. So right now we're in 2009. We've done some of the earlier history of the 2520, but now we're up to here 2009, and we're looking at the 2520 revealed. Okay, which is a series of presentations, about 20 of them or so, which you can find on YouTube, and we discussed that last time. This is a series that was done by Elder Paminda back in 2009, which I recommend that people have a look at and go over. This was done in 2009, which is the increase of knowledge of the early reign in the line of the priests. So if we were to draw it on the line, it looks like this. 2001 to 2014, which is the early reign. And we have here the increase of knowledge, which is in 2009. And this one formed the knowledge that was brought to view here is what informed the formalised study here in 2012, which then informed a prediction of time leading to 2014. So we see with the 2520, the theme of it is really about time. So we see a lot of time issues, we're adding up time. And this, when it's this increase of knowledge opens up, we get some information about time here, and then we get a real message on time here as well, which then, this one leads to this one, and then that relates to 2014. So if we want to understand this one, we really need to understand what was brought out here. So leading up to this point, we had knowledge, especially it was opened up and rediscovered the 2520, but in history the information was already out there that there were 7 dates that were 2520. So we had a line that we call Edson's line and a line that we call Miller's line, and I'll draw them out. So we had Edson, and he had a 2520. We had 2 different 2520s. Miller was aware of both, but chose to focus on this one, whereas Edson had said this is the only one and this one is not applicable. This one had to do with the Northern Kingdom, Northern Israel, and this one had to do with Southern Israel. And it was really seen as an either-or option. Which one is correct, one or the other? And that's how it's been for all that time, until we get to 2009, when Elder Paminda has taken the two and made them into one thing. So I'll illustrate how that looks as well, how they're brought together and what we learn from that. We connect them together, and then what we learn is that there's Israel here that goes in. It's almost a bit like a funnel. They go in, and then you've got Israel coming in. And in here, you have Israel as well, like scattered Israel there. So we see Israel, it's all to do with Israel going in, that'd be ancient Israel. And that's modern Israel that comes out. So we see that this here is like a punishment or a process that brings reformation to a group of people, so that they at the end have a body of people and also a set of doctrines that make them Israel. So joining them together, hopefully, it actually validates both of these views, makes them into one object, which means you have one group at the beginning that goes in and one group that comes out at the end, rather than having to decide out of one of those two things. So we see this as one connected history from 1798 to 1844. So we'll look at that in more detail. To do this connection is not just done arbitrarily, it's proven in this series, and that's essentially the point of it, to connect the two together. When the two is connected together, we get information based about some time, and a structure is formed, and then that informs this formalisation and goes forward. So in order for these things to be dependable, we really need to know how this was proven, because that's foundational then for everything that's built on top of that. So connecting the two together, connecting both 520s is given proof. It's proven. And the proofs, the materials that are used to prove this is firstly the Gospels, and that's namely Christ's discourse, which is the prophecy that Christ gave about basically the specific one in Matthew 24, and its parallel passages, which we're referring to here. Then we have this one leads us to look at Revelation 11, and specifically verses 1 to 2, which we can proof text from the first one. We can go into this one, and we can also use this to prove the connections between the two 2520s, and then we go also to Daniel 9, verses 26 and 27 as well, which also become another proof for this, connecting the two. And then there are other plus others. There's some other passages that we can also bring in to prove this, basically that the two lines are connected to each other and they're all part of the same story. So in order for that to happen, we need to actually prove that. So that's where we're going to go moving forward. We're going to look today at the Gospels. We're going to review some of that about Christ's discourse and the connections that were made via that one, and then we're going to head into Revelation 11, verses 1 to 2, and start going there and seeing how that, in the same way, separately, but in the same, it does the same thing as this discourse, although it does it independently, and it just forms another proof of that one. So in 44 into this.
Revelation 11 to 1844.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. How do we connect Revelation 11 to 1844? Do you remember? We will do that again anyway. Do you remember?
The beginning of the temple building? No, that was before then.
Yeah,
To do
it's
with
the
the temple
context.
building?
Yeah, the context when we can see sanctuary language being used, and we're going to review that. So that's a little bit of, some people may have forgotten. But this passage here, the reason we look at it is because there's some proof texting. We have in that passage, and I've written it all out. We'll have a look at that. We have Gentiles there, and we have trampling or treading, and we have a holy city. And there's that's the proof text, but then when we go there, there's also the context of when John actually is in history, when he's given these terms. So all of those things will help us to connect 1844 there. And Christ's discourse itself connects to this passage by use of the proof texting. And in fact, I might do that in blue. So you can just see it's a different connection. That's through proof texting, and this one is also through proof texting. That's the abomination of desolation proof text. And this one has got to do with this idea of Gentiles treading in the holy city. And we got sanctuary language, and we will be looking at how that relates to 1844. If I want to connect 1844 to 1798, how does Jesus do that in this discourse? Because it's there. And just have a look there, perhaps you'll see that. So it's not just us making a connection. That's why it's important. It's not just our wishful thinking that these are connected, but Christ himself connects those two dates, especially if we apply the on the clouds phrasing here and the end of that discourse, finishing at 1844 rather than the second Advent. So can somebody just spell out how Jesus connects those two there? Not sure?
John 2:20.
John 2:20. But I'd like us to stay within these three chapters. So somewhere in these chapters here, Jesus makes a connection between this event and this event. And really, it might not be as complicated as you think I'm asking, but basically I'm just saying it's because of the way that the structures of the histories are. We've got the Millerite history given here, and Christ gives us a description of this time period and all the events that happen here during this Millerite time history. So he's talking about the Dark Ages, skips right over, takes you to Millerite history. What would have been the second Advent, ideally, couldn't be because of the backsliding of God's people and because of their failure. We then have to basically essentially wander in the wilderness like the Israelites did, are wandering here until we can arrive at another generation. And if that's the case, we're not using this progressive, we don't stretch this discourse, we don't stretch this right out to the second Advent. That's actually impossible. It has to be reapplied. And this is like a contingency plan. I don't know if you know what a contingency plan means, but if something goes wrong, you might have a backup plan. In some senses, this phrase built into the passage, it gave the potential or the possibility for the verses to still be true and correct and reapplied this way, so that it had two alternate ways maybe that it could have been applied to history without having to stretch out this huge span of time, which I don't think would make sense if you understand the verses that lead up to this statement here. So in that sense, because we have 1844 applied, Christ's description takes you from here, that's the start, and it takes you to here, and it ends in 1844. You break it up into three histories, so you can see a clear history there, clear description of this time period, which starts from 1798 and goes to 1844. and Christ connects 1844 into this whole story. So it's part of the discourse. 1844 is part of the discourse because of the clouds, okay, or because we apply it that way, to basically the investigative judgment. Okay. That's how that's brought into this story. And we can also see there's other reasons that we can bring 1844 into there, because we know that there's an understanding of the sanctuary and there's understanding of Sabbath and all of these things, the end of the 2300 days as well. So here we have in 1844, it's the end of 2520, but it's also the end of the discourse. Okay, so the end of the 2520 and the end of the Christ discourse is the same thing. And so that's how we can bring in 1844 into that. And it's connected to 1798 because that's Millerite history from there to there. Or it's the end of this Millerite history in terms of this prophecy that he gave. We can connect Papal Rome to 1798, the end of the Dark Ages. We can connect the trampling of spiritual Jerusalem is done by Papal Rome. Literal and spiritual Jerusalem are connected, just to move things along a little bit here, okay, because Christ basically makes no distinction between, he doesn't go into the history between these two dates, he just connects them. So you've got a connection of what happened to literal Jerusalem and what's going to happen to spiritual Jerusalem. And we see that especially in Luke 21, verse 24. We're going to look at that. I've got that to go into more detail. Okay, 70 AD and 538 are definitely connected. Okay, you can see that there because of the two histories are brought together as there's no distinction made. It's just all part of that progressive history. So you can see them connected to each other. And there may be more. There's plenty there connected, and all of this forms part of the discourse, okay? So that's all connected. Did anybody have any questions about that before we move on? The verse here, I can read that out too if you want to look that up. That's which I'll do it in Mark 13. 26. That's there, I can read it to you. And then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory? So you can see how that could be applied to the second advent, which would take you to a verse in Revelation where every eye shall see him, all of that, or Daniel, where we've got Christ being brought on the cloud. So there's both. Okay, so hopefully that's okay. Christ has connected all of these features together. This is of particular importance to us today when we'll be going to Revelation 11, verses 1 to 2, and seeing all of that. This connection here, it's the verse in Luke that there's actually one verse which spans this, but within the one verse it spans its history. And then that verse connects you to the Revelation 11, 1 to 2. And then there's a verse there that refers to 70 AD, which takes you to the Daniel one. So these two links have to do with this point in time here, which is kind of key because that's where you're connecting the pagan and the papal together. So that's all part of that. And here, if we just want to talk about this literal and spiritual Jerusalem too, before we move on, we've got Luke 21, verse 20, and you can compare that with Luke 21, 24. I will read out Luke 21, 20, which says, And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. So which Jerusalem are we talking about? Literal or spiritual Jerusalem? Someone can contribute. I'll read it once more and then perhaps someone can answer. When ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Which one do you think Jesus is talking about? The Dark Ages or this destruction of Jerusalem in that verse?
Destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, literal?
Literal? Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so and then we go to Luke 21:24. It says that Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So Jerusalem again, but it's going to be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Do you think he's talking about 70 AD or
1798.
Okay, yeah. So Jesus is talking about Jerusalem, but he's also talking about Jerusalem here. So he's connecting those two together. Hopefully you can just see that even in just these two verses, that Jesus is calling them both Jerusalem. Okay, but we're not talking about literal Jerusalem here anymore. It's been destroyed. People are scattered. Christians are scattered, and even the Jews end up scattered. So we're talking about spiritual Jerusalem. You can tell because the times of the Gentiles have to be fulfilled. That's just a sort of an example. Now, I want to talk about literal to spiritual before we move on. We're doing a lot of literal to spiritual in this. A little look at it. While I write that heading, can you get your Bibles or your Bible apps out? We can look at these verses together. It'll just be Bible verses. We'll start with Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. So look that up. Can somebody read that verse out, please?
I can read it if you like.
Yes, please.
For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places.
Okay, great. Now, what is this verse telling us? What are we wrestling? What are we not wrestling against now?
Well, it's not a literal wrestling against other people in this world. It's a spiritual thing.
Yeah. So, what are the literal things in this verse? List, if you can list them.
Flesh and blood.
Yeah. Flesh and blood. Okay. And I'm going to just add wrestle as well. It's not a literal wrestle. Okay.
No.
And that's pretty clear from the verses. Okay. So we basically have a spiritual wrestling with, it's defined in here because it gives you the definition there of what we are wrestling against is principalities and powers. So I'm not going to write what the spiritual is, but we would just point out, I guess, that this is a literal to spiritual. Flesh and blood then becomes a spiritual term. Okay, I think that's pretty easy. Ephesians 6:17. That's just a few verses down. If anybody wants to, and Lynn, you're welcome, or anyone else, just list for me, or somebody can read it out actually, and then we'll talk about the literal. So anybody else volunteering to unmute and just read out the verse?
Can you hear me, Katherine?
Oh, yes, please. Yeah, we can hear you. Actually, I can't anymore.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, it's just a bit faint, but we can hear you now.
All right. And take the helmet of salvation and
Can't hear you anymore.
Want me to read it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God.
Wonderful. So what's literal there?
Sword.
Oh, we've got, yes, helmet and sword. And we can see that these are now given, you know, basically that, you know, we even see this demonstrated. Ancient Israel did wrestle with flesh and blood. They were literally battling the nations around them. But now we've moved to a spiritual warfare. And they used to wear helmets and they would carry real swords. That was ancient Israel's dispensation. Now we have a spiritual helmet and a spiritual sword. So hopefully that's clear. John chapter 6:58. Volunteer.
Yeah.
This is that bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers did eat manna, and are dead. He that eateth of this bread shall live forever.
Thanks for reading that out. Can I ask what literal things you see there in that verse?
Bread.
Yep. Another term is used in the verse as well?
Manna.
Manna, yep. Okay. Okay, and you can see that we're being instructed that these now have spiritual meanings. So, all right, Ezekiel 4:6. Somebody can just volunteer to read it.
And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on the right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year.
Okay, so what do you think we go from literal to spiritual here in this one?
Day for a year.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to bring out there. So we have day. All right. So day, we have going from literal to spiritual. we can see that, even back then they were given sort of like a day for a year, and now when we look at time, we understand that principle, so that's been applied. Most of these we see going from literal to spiritual around the time of Christ. That's when we get introduced to the ideas of spiritual bread, spiritual manna, spiritual battles, all of that. Day for a year, you can see that was even given in that ancient time. But when they took time prophecies, I think they took the 70 years as literal years for Babylon. But now we apply these things spiritually. So you can see a transition happen across history. Next one here is Romans 9, verse 6b. So just the second half of that verse. You can look that up. It's really the last part that I wanted, just the last sentence.
For they are not all Israel which are of Israel.
Great. Okay, so the literal is
Israel?
yeah. Okay. So we see Israel from literal to spiritual, pretty easy one. But we can see that's justifiable as well. That's part of my point, I suppose. We're not just, the Bible gives us permission to do literal to spiritual. These are the verses that prove that. All right, Revelation 14, verse 8. Somebody could read that verse out, please.
Babylon is fallen, is fallen.
Yeah, can you read the whole verse?
Sorry, I cheated.
If anyone can read that verse out. Yeah.
And there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication.
Thank you. Now, can you tell me everything that's literal in that verse, all those symbolic things that are literal? What do you see? What things go from literal to spiritual?
Could it be a
Babylon?
reference to
Babylon? Yeah, what else?
could it be a reference to the Roman Church actually infiltrating all the Protestant denominations?
So that we apply that verse to the messages of Millerite history. And so my understanding is the application for who Babylon is a little bit more complex because we're dealing with that period. But at this stage, I'm kind of not wanting to define all the terms, what they actually have their spiritual application. My point really just to point out that there are some and that they do have spiritual applications without going into all that, because otherwise we'd have to define all of them and it will take us off course a little bit. But we can see that Babylon here, at the very least, does not mean a literal city in that part of the world. We can see that it has a symbolic meaning, don't we? So what else is in that verse that I could put on this list? Wine. Yeah. Is anyone drinking literal wine in this story? You don't have the nations actually drinking wine. It's not because they're drinking alcohol, is it? So wine has a spiritual meaning. What else? Who gave the message? Did an angel come down? An actual angel? In that history, when the message was given, we didn't see an actual angel appear like Gabriel. We see literal angels appearing in ancient history in the stories about ancient Israel, but we don't see literal angels in our history. We see spiritual angels. There's one more at least that I can see.
Nations.
Do you think it's spiritual nations or literal nations? I'm not sure that one is as clear.
How about city?
Yes, I can put city there. It's like a synonym for Babylon. But we're not talking about a literal city, we're talking about in a symbolic sense. Like
The word for nations can mean nations, kindreds, tongues, languages, family groups. It's referring to corporate bodies, I think.
We put nations there if you like, so a bit broader than just,
yeah.
You know, yep, okay. And the very last word.
Last word.
Fornication.
Okay, so obviously there's no literal fornication going on, right? That fornication has got to do with relationships between children and states and things like that, which is all symbolic represented by fornication. Illegal relationships shouldn't be happening. Okay, so you can see that verse is loaded with literal terms that we take to spiritual meaning. To understand,
there's also no literal falling.
Yeah, true. No literal fall. So fall has a symbolic meaning as well, a spiritual fall. So yeah, that one's really loaded. But for us to understand what these verses are talking about, we have to first understand the literal, the literal story, so we understand, there's aspects of wine, literal wine, that teach us about the spiritual meaning, isn't there? And there's things about literal Babylon in history that teach us what spiritual Babylon is like. So there's so much to be gained from this literal to spiritual. It's very educational, helps us to understand. I guess God has to come down to a level where we're at and explain things in terms we understand so that we can grasp the bigger story. And the last one I just wanted to use, and there's more, Mark 14:58. I'm just waiting for someone to read it out.
We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.
Okay, thank you for reading that out. So what do we see here in, literal words?
Temple.
Temple. Okay. We also see hands here. There's the idea of it being made with hands or built again without hands. When we're going to rebuild the temple, you can see that there is, not human hands, but God's hand. It's not God's literal hand. We take a spiritual meaning. So perhaps we can think of other examples. I thought of, that there's also the word light. We have, literal light can instruct us about spiritual light, and we have the lamb. The lamb, the literal lamb can represent a spiritual lamb as well.
With that last verse, Katherine, with that last verse, would we also put 3 days down there as not being literal? I mean, they're talking about, obviously, Christ in the tomb was, well, even that's like that was 3 days, but in the literal sense. But when it's talking about building the temple, spiritually speaking, is there an application spiritually for the 3 days as well?
I don't know. It does sound like it because you're at a time period where there is another temple built without hands, but I don't see how 3 days would add up there.
No,
3.5.
it just seems to be.
Yes.
Yeah.
I could put it with a question mark, and it also says within. Yeah. If it said 3.5, I might be tempted to say Dark Ages or something, but I don't think that fits very well. So I'm not sure where to go with 3 days.
No, I didn't necessarily know where it was pointing, but it just seems to be being used in the same way that the other literal things are being used. So whether it comes up at some point, but at the moment, I wouldn't know.
I think this one is probably literal. And we know that this period of time when he says this is in the transition period, we were going from literal to spiritual. We have a literal temple and it's going to become the spiritual temple right around this point in time during the actual death of Christ. We see the end of the literal sacrifices and all of that right at that juncture there. And he's going to in 3 literal days, but there will be a spiritual temple. I think that maybe that this one, because of where this statement is located in time, it's right at that juncture where we're taking literal things and going to spiritual terms. It could be only applicable literally there, because really that's when he does, Jesus himself is talking about moving into a spiritual kingdom from a literal kingdom. So Jesus, we have different applications for words as well. So sometimes maybe you could say the temple is Jesus, you could say the temple has different applications in different, you can take a symbol and you can apply it different ways, just answering somebody's comment there in the chat. So I guess moving on from there, I just wanted to look at that whole concept of literal to spiritual. I wasn't sure really how to draw this, but this is the best I came up with. Okay, so we have a time period where we have literal terms, like ancient Israel, the literal temple, literal sacrifices and all of that. And we know we do spiritual over here. But in my mind, really, these things are like span all this time because we have had, I'll just write that spiritual. A lot of these spiritual things are eternal. It has been a cosmic battle right all the way along. And we have this little picture here of people with swords and, we have people there with their swords. And we have how we draw the temple. We have these literal things here that help us to understand things that are happening really big on a big scale. You could argue that, there's literal Israel here, but they were also like a spiritual Israel as well, even at the time. And the sanctuary has existed presumably across that whole time period. So this literal here teaches us about the big story about the spiritual things, which we can't in our minds naturally grasp without a little bit of help, some picture stories that God can give us through history that then illustrate the spiritual reality. So I want to give us a couple of terms and I want you to tell me, where do I put this term, under literal or spiritual? Okay, if I was to say type and antitype, where would I put type and where would I put antitype?
I think type would be literal, wouldn't it?
I agree. Antitype. Okay, what if I was to say something is an example and something is the actual thing? Where would I write example and where would I write actual?
Example is spiritual.
You think example is the spiritual. Does anyone else disagree with that?
That's sort of literal.
Example is literal.
The example is spiritual.
Example is spiritual. And this one is the actual. So if I look at this and I have a sword and a helmet, is the literal helmet, is that the actual thing that we need to learn about? Or is the literal helmet an example of something that we need to understand? So is the spiritual helmet the example of this literal helmet, or is it the other way around?
The other way around. It's supernatural that we understand the spiritual.
Okay, so the literal helmet or sword or temple is the example that teaches us about the actual. Is that okay with everybody?
Yeah.
So the literal is actually the example, and this is the actual thing that we need to understand. All right, so if I'm going to say something is real or not real, which one is real and which one is not real?
They're both real, aren't they?
In a sense they are, but one of them is but for a moment and blows away like the grass of the field and disappears.
Christ is real. Is the actual.
Yeah, so if we want to understand the real Israel or the real Babylon or the real bread, which one is real? Just you know, one is just a picture story, isn't it? Like a movie on a screen or something like that, where Earth's history is really but a brief moment in time, projected on a screen, if you like, and it helps us to understand here.
Spiritual.
This is real because this is eternal, and this is just for a moment. So if I was forced to choose, I know both are real. I know that there's real objects, that they are real. But if I had to allocate them, I would say this is the real, like in agreement with, I think, Margaret. And this here is the not real. I know it's, you know, we're living in a real reality. We're not imagining everything. But this here is so temporary, really, in some sense. When we look back from eternity, it'll seem quite not real, I think. So if
When
I was
I
going
get,
to say,
sorry to interrupt, when I get confused, I always think of the agricultural model and the parable of the seed. You know, the kingdom of heaven is like a seed. The seed is real, but the spiritual kingdom is actually the real thing. The seed is not real, even though it's real. So the spiritual is always a real thing as well. And that's the point of that parable, is it's the spiritual kingdom that's real. The seed is not, even though it is literal. And I've probably just muddied what you've said.
yeah, it's a bit of, I know what you're saying, but it is a mind bender in some ways. So if you can find, like Terry has done, an example that helps you to understand, like for me, I think then when I take the sanctuary, that helps me because there was a literal temple in Jerusalem. They used to take their worship there. They did all of that. But the real deal, the thing that we care about, the most important thing that concerns us, in fact, everyone probably in the universe, is what is going on in heaven, what that all means in a spiritual sense. That's the real deal. And the reason God gave that economy, the Jewish economy, and that whole system was simply to be like a storybook or something that would give them and us a picture which they could grapple with, being humans with a limited experience, something that they could take and then learn what the real thing is. So for me, I guess one of my favourites is To Understand It by the Sanctuary. And you might have your own one which clicks with you. And perhaps if you do find you're lost further down the track, sometimes we need reminding, you can think about that, whichever one helps you the most, I guess. Okay, so I'm going to give you two phrases. Oh, yeah. Oh.
Could I just say the thought that occurred to me with that is that really, in a way, when you look at our methodology of parables, everything in this world can be used in a parabolic way, and in a way God uses them to teach us about the real world to come, which is the eternal world. So everything is temporary, so it's almost permanent and temporary. So what we've got in this world is actually not real in the context of parable methodology. So everything's a parable and telling us about what's coming, telling us about what God's real kingdom is, maybe.
Yeah. And can you think of any other worldly examples that come to mind for you? Other parables, even just in your own experience, other things that you think of?
Yeah, when Moses was building the temple, the burdens that was given to him, it was just a copy of the true temple, which is in heaven.
Yeah, that's right. And there was the 10 Commandments on stones. He had literal stone tablets, which represent something real, eternal in heaven. Okay, so that's great. I think of like marriage and human relationships being parables of something spiritual and bigger than us, big and eternal. There's so much that we can, there's dirt, we think of dirt or things like that, a sin, leprosy. There's plenty of examples of things that are literal that have a spiritual meaning, and this one here is the main thing that we're concerned with, and these we just use to understand that one. So if I was going to say what you see and all there is, where do you think I should put that? If I had to choose, where would I put what you see and all there is? Which one is all?
Would be in temporary. What you see is temporary.
Okay, so this is what we see. Okay, and so therefore this one must be all there is. Yeah. Just taking some more recent language. If I had to choose child and adult, because we're supposed to be thinking as adults and not necessarily like children. So if I had to choose, where would I put child and adult? How would an adult think?
What you see now.
Child is what they see.
Child is what you see now, and adult is what's coming after the child.
And I think you see that in the real world, don't you? That children, especially when they're young enough to just play peekaboo, children are pretty concerned with what they can see right now. I had, I used to have a child and take them to the playground, put them on a swing, and we were about to go somewhere. We were going to go somewhere fantastic. I don't know whether it was something very exciting for a child. I don't know where. And I wanted to get my child off the swing so we could go on time. And the child was just concerned with what it could see at the time. It just wanted to go on the swing and it didn't care. And I would try to say, but that's not all there is. We're going to go somewhere fantastic and even better. But the child was latched onto what he could see. He was a boy. And I wanted to, I was focused on something I couldn't see, but I knew it was going to be much better. And in the same way, what we can see here, people get attached to the literal world. We can't see the spiritual world. And in some ways, we're like the children that don't want to get off the swing to go to the theme park or the big holiday to, some sunny beach or something like that. And kind of, if we're like children, we're focused on the literal, but our minds really need to be, as adults, spiritual adults, on the spiritual and not get caught up in what we can see here. So yeah, just a little lesson from that. And there's the last two terms, fast and slow. If I was going to use my fast brain or my slow brain, where would you put that?
Fast is what you can see. There is what there is.
Yep. So if you use your fast brain, you're going to be thinking in the literals or the spirituals. I think you might have said, but I might have missed.
Literal.
Will we agree? We'll put the fast brain here. Our fast brain will just jump to conclusions, and we're focused on the literal. It takes more time and effort, doesn't it? Certainly more effort to get the slow one. We have to understand the spiritual eternal things. It takes more work. You could even put wise here because we're supposed to be the wise, and you could consider wise and foolish as well, if you wanted to.
Can I ask a question, or can I throw something out there?
You can always ask a question.
You know those lines that we draw, line upon line. We're building something. You know, maybe we're building the temple, but we're actually reform lines. We're actually reforming our characters. Just that, go with your. We're drawing these lines on the board, and we're saying this is what's going on here. But are we actually reforming our characters? Does this whole scenario fit into your lecture?
I believe that we live in a literal world. We're living in reality, and we have a literal reformation going on in our lives. But we also have, as a movement, we have reformations going on. As a structure, as a set of doctrines, we also have reformations. When we take our line and we have baptism at 9/11, that's thinking in a spiritual sense, because we weren't all here in 9/11. We didn't get baptized literally 9/11. This is talking about a spiritual story about a body of people or a group. So it's sort of more on the spiritual level. But that doesn't mean that we don't literally get baptized and we don't literally have our own personal character formation. We can see ourselves as the body of Christ. As a body, we're getting rid of sin. The sin is our doctrines, our doctrines of inequality. So as a movement, as a body, which is like a spiritual version of an individual, us as a movement are dealing with sin and getting rid of sin. But that doesn't mean that as individuals, we don't do that too. As individuals, we have our own individual literal story of our lives, literal baptism, literal reforms, literal ridding of sin on an individual level. So I think we're still, in some sense, we're still in a literal history, which is why we still have literal marriages. We still have literal things going on. We have parent-child relationships that teach us about spiritual things. That doesn't all end simply because we understand the spiritual. We continue to be instructed by literal things that are going on in our lives. Does that answer your question? I think it was Josephine, was that you? Does that help?
I understood it, but I just wanted to throw it in there for a discussion.
Okay. Hopefully I discussed it in a way that you
went through it.
Okay, that was what you were kind of getting at.
Yep.
So we're nearly finished. So I'm just grab some things off by bumping into it. I'll just fix that. 21, 24. Okay, Luke 21, 24. Reason I talked about literal to spiritual has to do with this 25-20 thing. So it wasn't for no reason. We have this verse here. This is part of Christ's discourse that says 3 histories there, sorry. 3 histories. Okay, so Christ broken down that narrative. Well, he gave it as one narrative, and Elder Paminda had basically pointed out these breaks here, which splits it into 3 histories. And here we see right when Christ is giving this story about what's happening, and he's talking, and he gets up to Luke 21, 24, and he's describing here this time period here, which is where he makes this leap across. So I've written it up here so we can underline some of the literal words that we have. So somebody could read this verse out. And then we'll underline the words that we see. Just a volunteer to read it.
And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled.
Thank you. Okay, so we're in the mindset now of looking for these words and terms. So what do you see there that you want to pick out as some terms that we might want to explore in terms of literal to spiritual? Or I might just highlight, in fact, maybe we'll read Revelation 11. No, I think we'll do what we said. Yeah, we'll look at the terms first.
How about sword?
Sword.
Nations.
Okay.
Jerusalem.
Yep, I'm going to do that one in red because we're going to tie that in with Revelation 11 too.
Does that Gentiles, literal people?
Gentiles, yep. You don't need to know what the spiritual things are. You just point out what the terms are.
Until.
Until, no, I think I'll leave until. Although you might be right, but I might leave that one.
Times.
Times, yep. I'm going to put. What will I do? Will I do that in red or not? I guess we'll just do times of the Gentiles as one thing.
How about the edge of the sword? It's a sword, but it's.
Yeah, okay, yeah, go with the edge of the sword might. I'm not saying necessarily we are going to make spiritual applications of all of these things, but just we could consider them. So let's just see. Yeah, there's maybe a captive. You might be able to say there's a spiritual captivity. There's a treading down. That's the other thing I wanted to point out there. All right. So when we take until. Yeah, somebody said until, but I don't know what a spiritual application of until would be. Like a literal until and then a spiritual until. I guess you're relating that probably to times. So times might be a better way of saying until, perhaps.
Until would be linked to.
It's not really a thing. Pardon?
Until would be linked to fulfill.
Yeah, until it's fulfilled. So there's a time, basically a time prophecy there. You know, Elder Terry had mentioned fall earlier as well, which could be considered, but we don't know yet whether that is actually meant to be taken spiritually or literally at this point. Now, if I'm going to take these words, trodden down, Gentiles, I want us to see, have a look at Revelation 11 too. If somebody could volunteer to read that.
But the cord which is without the temple leave out and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months.
Thank you. Now tell me which things here have to do with some of these ones here. What do you see that's the same?
Gentiles.
Tread and trodden down.
Okay, Gentiles and the trodden down, the treading, tread underfoot.
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Anyone else had any others that they see in terms of? Pardon?
Holy City.
Holy City, thank you. Yeah, Holy City in Jerusalem. We can see that. Okay. And because we need to wind up, I'll just highlight some other ones that we can see here that aren't the same, that we've got court, we have temple, we've got a measuring, and Gentiles of Holy City should tread underfoot. 42 months, it has to do with time as well, if you can see that. 42 months kind of has to do with time. All right, so the reason that this discourse takes us to Revelation 11:2 is because of these Holy City, Jerusalem, Gentiles, times, and a treading. Okay, can we see that? That's how come we're proof texted and we've jumped from the Gospels into Revelation 11. And then we have other language here, court, measuring, and temple. We can see sanctuary language there. And this verse here, it's bridging 70 AD to 538 AD because Jesus has just described what's going to happen in the lead up to 70 AD. He's in the middle of talking about 70 AD and then he transitions into 538. So we're transitioning here from the literal history into a spiritual history, and Jesus is doing that seamlessly. So there is, this battle going on with spiritual Jerusalem, but the discourse all above this is all about literal Jewish history leading up to 70 AD. That's all literal temple, literal Jerusalem. And then we're transitioning now at this verse here is happening right in this junction here. And that's where we are for this verse. And we're going to connect the literal here, which is above, up there in the discourse. And then we're going down now into a spiritual application. And we know it's spiritual because we're talking about the times of the Gentiles, which has to do with Gentiles that have to do with the 40 and 2 months. And we know that's the 1260. So this verse here can just show you that Jesus moves from literal to spiritual in his discourse. And he's connecting the literal Jerusalem with the spiritual Jerusalem, literal trampling, spiritual trampling. And you can just see even within this one verse, which is where you sort of see that that's where he transitions across. So that's an important verse because that shows you how he connects these two histories together, how he connects 70 and 538. We know they're important dates for the 2520, and Jesus is talking about essentially what is going on during the 2520 that takes you to the end of the 2520. So his story is about the punishment or the restoration of Israel leading up to that date. So that's how we're going to go into Revelation 11:2. And then we're going to look at what these terms are, the court, the measuring, and the temple, because now we're talking about 1844, which is the context of this verse. And when we get to 1844, there's a court, but it's not a literal court. There's a temple, it's not a literal temple. There's a measuring, it's not a literal measuring. We have Gentiles, but they're not literal Gentiles. We have a holy city, it's not a literal one. We have a treading that has happened. So this just refers back to the 1260, and it tells you it wasn't a literal treading underfoot, and it wasn't for literally 42 months. So all of this is spiritual meaning. We want to be wise. We want to understand the spiritual. We want to know the real. So we want to understand what this verse means. All right. So we'll stop there, and we will close in prayer. Please, Neil. Dear Lord God in heaven, we thank you so much for the presentation that we had this morning, that spiritual food which you gave us, the reproof and correction that we receive from you, which is for our benefit, for the benefit of others around us, and essential for us to enter into your kingdom, which does not permit sin. We thank you that you reveal to us what sin looks like more and more, especially to those who are willing to open their eyes and see and open their ears and to hear. And we thank you so much for condescending to meet us where we are, to being so patient with us, but yet pushing us forward at a pace which is necessary for the ushering in of a better kingdom, and for helping people all around who are struggling and suffering, to give them a message of hope, that they can have a vision of heaven which appeals to all. We thank you so much for that, and thank you for our leaders, for their diligence and their uncompromising behaviour towards toleration or not tolerating sin in this movement, so that we can be a group of people that have a message of hope and purity to give to others, Lord, and that we can reflect your beauty and your character more. And we ask for more reproof and correction. We ask for more training, and we thank you that you have been patient with us all this time. We pray that you would help us to understand the literal to spiritual, that our eyes would be focused on the spiritual, and that we would think wisely and as adults, and that we would be able to contemplate on these things and understand what you're doing, what you've done with the 2520 and what you continue to do today. And we just offer the rest of our day that you would be honoured by our worship and our service, and that we just want to thank you for our fellowship. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.